crimson Texas sky. Evelyn Carter had sworn she'd never owe a man anything again. But when her ranch was threatened, the only person who could save it was Jesse Boone, the most feared gunslinger in the West. He smirked, tilting his hat back. "Your land's safe, sweetheart," he murmured. "Now, what do I get in return?" Chapter 1. The Whispers of a Barren Land. The wind, a ceaseless, mournful sigh, swept across the parched plains, carrying with it the fine, gritty dust that coated everything Evelyn Carter's weathered hands, the rough-hewn wood of her porch, the sparse, tenacious blades of grass clinging to life in the cracked earth. It was a land that demanded respect, a land that gave little and took much, and Evelyn, at 58, felt every year of that harsh bargain etched onto her soul. She sat on the porch swing, its rusted chains creaking a familiar rhythm, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sky bled into the earth in a hazy wash of orange and purple. The sunset, once a source of solace, now felt like a daily reminder of the dwindling light in her own life. The ranch, her legacy, her everything, was slipping through her fingers like the dust devils that danced across the barren landscape. The letter crinkled in her hand, its edges softened from repeated readings. The bank's formal language couldn't disguise the brutal truth: foreclosure. Unless she could repay the outstanding loan, a sum that seemed as vast and insurmountable as the sky above, she would lose everything. Her father's ranch, the land that had been in the Carter family for 3 generations, would be gone. A hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry echoing the hollowness in her chest. Evelyn had always been a fighter. She'd buried her husband, raised her daughters single-handedly, and weathered droughts, storms, and cattle rustlers. But this felt different. This felt like the end. The sound of hoofbeats, distant but distinct, broke through her despair. She knew that rhythm. It wasn't the familiar gait of her ranch hands. This was a single rider, approaching at a steady, unhurried pace. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. Visitors were rare and rarely welcome, this far out. She rose, her joints protesting with a familiar ache, and moved to the edge of the porch, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. Years of living on the frontier had taught her caution, a lesson etched in blood and loss. As the rider drew closer, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking the silhouette, the broad shoulders, the way he sat his horse with an almost arrogant ease, the wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. Jesse Boone. The name itself was a legend, whispered in hushed tones in saloons and around campfires. The fastest gun in the West, they said. A man who lived outside the law, a man who owed allegiance to no one, a man who killed without hesitation, without remorse. And yet, here he was, riding towards her ranch, his presence a dark omen against the dying light. Evelyn had met him only once before, years ago, at a cattle auction in Abilene. She remembered the way his eyes, the color of gunmetal, had seemed to pierce through her, assessing, judging. She remembered the shiver of fear, and something else, a flicker of something she couldn't name, that had run through her. He had been younger then, but the aura of danger, of untamed power, had been unmistakable. He reined in his horse at the edge of the yard, the animal snorting and pawing the ground. Jesse Boone dismounted with a fluid grace that belied his size, his movements economical, precise. He stood there, a silent, imposing figure, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows behind him. He looked older, harder. Lines of hardship were etched around his eyes and mouth, and there was a weariness in his stance that hadn't been there before. But the eyes were the same, cold, calculating, and unnervingly intense. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent another shiver down her spine. It was a voice that had given orders, issued threats, and spoken final words to countless men. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Mr. Boone," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. "What brings you to my ranch?" He took a step closer, his spurs jingling softly on the hard-packed earth. He removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. I heard you were having some difficulties. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Evelyn's hand tightened on the rifle. I don't know what you've heard, but I don't need any help. Especially not from you. A faint smile, devoid of any real humor, touched his lips. That's not what I heard. The bank's about to foreclose, Mrs. Carter. And once they do, this land will be up for grabs. There are others who are interested. Evelyn knew exactly who he was talking about. The Blackwood brothers. Ruthless, greedy, and with a long-standing grudge against the Carters. They'd been circling like vultures, waiting for her to fail. I'll handle it, she said, her voice tight with defiance, even though she knew it was a lie. Jesse Boone studied her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. You're a proud woman, Mrs. Carter. I admire that. But pride won't pay the bank. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He tossed it towards her, and it landed at her feet with a soft thud. Evelyn looked down at it, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what it was, even before she opened it. That's enough to cover your debt, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. Consider it a loan. Evelyn stared at him, speechless. She slowly bent down and picked up the pouch. It was heavy, filled with gold coins. Enough to save her ranch. Enough to save everything. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his.
Why?
She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why would you do this? He shrugged, his gaze shifting towards the horizon, as if he were looking at something far beyond the boundaries of her ranch. Let's just say I have my reasons. I don't take charity, Mr. Boone, she said, her pride warring with a desperate need to accept his offer. He turned back to her, his eyes locking with hers. It's not charity, Mrs. Carter. It's an investment. And I expect to be repaid.
How?
The word escaped her lips before she could stop it. He smirked, tilting his hat back, the fading light catching the glint of gold in his eyes. Your land's safe, sweetheart, he murmured, his voice low and laced with a hint of something dangerous, something alluring. Now, what do I get in return? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken possibilities and a debt that went far deeper than money. The wind whispered through the dry grass, carrying the scent of dust and the faint, metallic tang of something far more ancient and primal, the scent of blood. Chapter 2. Shadows cast by a setting Sunday. Evelyn stared at him, the pouch of gold heavy in her hand, its weight a tangible representation of the impossible choice before her. Her mind raced, trying to decipher the hidden meaning behind his words, the unspoken price of his generosity. Was it land he wanted? Influence? Something far more personal? The setting sun painted the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep violet, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around them like restless spirits. The beauty of the landscape was a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within her. I don't understand, she stammered, her voice betraying her confusion and a growing sense of unease. She had dealt with men all her life, hard-working ranchers, shrewd businessmen, even the occasional outlaw, but Jesse Boone was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. He exuded a dangerous charisma, a quiet power that both frightened and intrigued her. He took a step closer, his presence filling her vision, the scent of leather and dust, and something indefinably him enveloping her. It's simple, Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very air around them. You need money. I have it. We make a deal. A deal that involves. What exactly? She pressed, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She needed to know, needed to understand the terms of this unexpected and unsettling agreement. He paused, his gunmetal eyes studying her face, searching for something she couldn't quite decipher. Let's just say, I need a place to stay. For a while. A place where I can be anonymous. Evelyn frowned. You? The Jesse Boone? The idea seemed ludicrous. He was a legend, a ghost story whispered in the dark. How could he possibly hope to disappear? This ranch is isolated, he continued, ignoring her disbelief. Far from the prying eyes of certain individuals. I need a place to lay low, to regroup. His words hinted at a hidden past, a life lived on the run, a world of danger and violence that Evelyn could only begin to imagine. She thought of the stories she'd heard, the rumors of his exploits, the men he'd killed. Was he running from the law? From a rival gang? From his own demons? And what do I get in return, besides the money? She asked, her voice regaining some of its steel. She wouldn't be intimidated. She couldn't afford to be. He smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. You get to keep your ranch, Mrs. Carter. And you get my protection. As long as I'm here, no one will bother you. Not the Blackwoods, not anyone. The offer was tempting, almost irresistible. The Blackwoods were a constant threat, their greed and ruthlessness a shadow hanging over her land. With Jesse Boone at her side, they wouldn't dare make a move. But at what cost? She looked at him, really looked at him, trying to see past the legend, past the dangerous aura, to the man beneath. She saw the weariness in his eyes, the lines of hardship etched on his face, the hint of vulnerability that he tried so hard to conceal. He was a man running from something, a man haunted by his past. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of something unexpected, a spark of empathy, a sense of connection to this enigmatic, dangerous stranger. You'll stay here? On my ranch? She asked, the words sounding strange and unreal even to her own ears. In the bunkhouse, he clarified. I won't be any trouble. I'll help out with the chores, earn my keep. I'm a fair hand with horses, and I can handle a rifle if need be. He was offering her a solution, a lifeline in a sea of despair. But it was a solution fraught with danger, with uncertainty, with the potential to shatter the fragile peace she had so carefully built. She thought of her daughter, Sarah, who lived in Denver with her husband and children. Sarah had urged her to sell the ranch, to move to the city, to escape the harshness of the frontier. But Evelyn couldn't. This land was in her blood, in her soul. It was her connection to her past, to her husband, to her father. It was all she had left. She looked at Jesse Boone, at the pouch of gold in her hand, at the vast, darkening expanse of her ranch. The decision was hers, and hers alone. A decision that could save her home, or destroy everything she held dear. All right, Mr. Boone, she said, her voice firm, resolute, despite the tremor in her hands. You have a deal. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise or perhaps admiration crossing his face. He nodded, a single, curt gesture. Good. I'll move my things in tomorrow. He turned to leave, then paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. One more thing, Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice low and serious. Don't tell anyone who I am. Not your ranch hands, not your neighbors, not anyone. To them, I'm just Jesse. A drifter looking for work. Evelyn nodded, understanding the need for secrecy, the danger that followed him like a shadow. I understand. He mounted his horse, the animal a dark silhouette against the fading light. He looked down at her, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness. You've made a wise choice, Mrs. Carter, he said, his voice a low whisper carried on the wind. Or perhaps a very foolish one. Time will tell. With that, he spurred his horse and rode off into the night, leaving Evelyn standing alone on her porch, the pouch of gold clutched in her hand, the weight of her decision settling upon her like the heavy, star-studded blanket of the night sky. The shadows seemed to deepen around her, whispering secrets and warnings she couldn't quite decipher, and a shiver ran down her spine, a premonition of the changes to come, of the storm that had just arrived on her doorstep. The air itself was still charged, however, humming very faintly. Chapter 3. The Price of Freedom's Echo. The morning dawned crisp and clear, the air carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint, earthy aroma of the previous night's dew. Evelyn had barely slept, her mind replaying her encounter with Jesse Boone, her thoughts a tangled web of apprehension and a strange, unsettling excitement. She had made a deal with the devil, some might say, but it felt more like a desperate pact with fate. She rose before dawn, as was her habit, and went through her usual routine brewing coffee, feeding the chickens, checking on the horses in the corral. But everything felt different, charged with a new sense of urgency, a heightened awareness of the world around her. The ranch hands, Jed and Silas, two grizzled old-timers who had worked for her for years, arrived shortly after sunrise. They were men of few words, their faces weathered and lined like the landscape itself, their loyalty unwavering. Evelyn had always treated them with respect, and they, in turn, had given her their dedication and hard work. She watched them as they saddled their horses, their movements practiced and efficient. She had to tell them about Jessie, about the arrangements she had made. But how to explain it? How to introduce a notorious gunslinger into their quiet, predictable world without causing alarm, without raising suspicions? "Jed, Silas," she said, her voice calm and steady, masking the turmoil within. "We'll have a new hand joining us today. Man named Jesse. He's a drifter, looking for work." Jed, the elder of the two, squinted at her, his eyes narrowed.
"A drifter, man?"
"This time of year?" "He seems capable," Evelyn replied, trying to sound nonchalant. "He says he's good with horses, and he can handle a rifle." Silas, who rarely spoke, simply nodded, his expression unreadable. "He'll be staying in the bunkhouse," Evelyn continued. "I expect you to treat him with the same respect you show me." Jed and Silas exchanged a look, a silent communication that spoke volumes. They were wary, suspicious, but they wouldn't question her decision. They trusted her judgment, even if they didn't understand it. "Yes, ma'am," Jed said, his voice gruff but respectful. Evelyn felt a wave of relief wash over her. The first hurdle had been cleared, but she knew it was only the beginning. As if on cue, Jesse Boone rode into the yard, his horse's hooves drumming a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. He looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more human. He wore simple, worn clothes, denim trousers, a faded cotton shirt, a leather vest. His hat was pulled low, shading his eyes, but she could see the stubble on his jaw, the lines of weariness around his mouth. He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, and approached Evelyn and the ranch hands. He nodded to Jed and Silas, his gaze assessing them briefly, then turned to Evelyn. "Morning, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice a low drawl. "Ready to put me to work?" Evelyn introduced him to Jed and Silas, repeating her carefully crafted story about him being a drifter looking for work. The ranch hands greeted him with cautious nods, their eyes filled with unspoken questions. Jesse Boone, or rather Jesse as he was now known, proved to be a surprisingly hard worker. He was skilled with horses, as he had claimed, and he quickly earned the grudging respect of Jed and Silas. He was quiet, reserved, keeping to himself, but he always pulled his weight, never complaining, never shirking his duties. He moved into the bunkhouse, a small, sparsely furnished building that housed the ranch hands. He kept his belongings to a minimum: a bedroll, a saddlebag, a few changes of clothes, and, of course, his gun, which he never left out of his sight. Evelyn watched him, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was grateful for his presence, for the sense of security he provided, but she was also wary, constantly aware of the danger he represented, the secrets he kept hidden. She found herself drawn to him, despite her better judgment. She would catch herself watching him as he worked, admiring his strength, his quiet competence, the way he moved with such effortless grace. She would find herself listening for his voice, the low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. She knew it was foolish, dangerous, to feel anything for this man. He was a temporary fixture in her life, a means to an end. He would be gone as soon as his troubles were resolved. And yet, she couldn't deny the strange pull he had on her, the way he made her feel alive again, after years of quiet resignation. One evening, after a long day of work, Evelyn found herself sitting on the porch, watching the sunset. Jesse joined her, leaning against the railing, his presence a comforting weight in the gathering darkness. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft murmur of the wind. "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper, "for saving my ranch." He turned to her, his eyes glinting in the fading light. "I told you, it's an investment. But why me?" She persisted. "Why choose my ranch?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the horizon. "Let's just say I needed a place where I could be someone else."
For a while.
His words hinted at a deeper story, a past filled with pain and regret. Evelyn felt a surge of empathy for him, a desire to understand the man behind the legend. "What are you running from, Jessie?" she asked, her voice soft, gentle. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, she thought he might open up, might share his secrets with her. But then he looked away, his face hardening. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "The past is the past. It can't be changed." But Evelyn knew that wasn't true. The past always mattered. It shaped who we were, influenced our choices, haunted our dreams. And she knew, with a growing certainty, that Jesse Boone's past was a heavy burden, a price he was still paying, and a price she was beginning to fear. The very air between them crackled with unspoken tensions. Chapter 4. A bargain struck in twilight. The days settled into a rhythm, a quiet, predictable routine punctuated by the ever-present undercurrent of tension that Jesse Boone's presence brought to the ranch. He worked tirelessly, his strong hands calloused from years of hard labor, his movements efficient and purposeful. He rarely spoke, preferring to observe, to listen, his gunmetal eyes constantly scanning the horizon, as if expecting trouble to appear at any moment. Evelyn found herself watching him, studying him, trying to decipher the enigma that he was. She saw the way he interacted with the horses, gentling them with a touch that belied his reputation as a ruthless killer. She saw the way he helped Jed repair a broken fence, his knowledge of carpentry surprising her. She saw the way he sat alone in the evenings, staring into the campfire, his face etched with a sadness that tugged at her heart. She tried to keep her distance, to maintain a professional demeanor, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. She found herself drawn to him, her curiosity piqued by the mystery that surrounded him, her senses heightened by his proximity. The scent of him, leather, horses, and something indefinably male lingered in the air, a constant reminder of his presence. One afternoon, while they were working together in the corral, a sudden storm blew in, the sky turning a menacing shade of gray, the wind whipping up dust and debris. They rushed to secure the horses, their bodies brushing against each other as they worked, the air charged with an unexpected electricity. As the first fat raindrops began to fall, they took shelter in the barn, the air thick with the smell of hay and animals. The wind howled outside, rattling the wooden walls, the rain drumming a relentless tattoo on the roof. They stood in silence, the only sound the storm raging around them, their bodies close, almost touching. Evelyn could feel the heat radiating from him, the tension emanating from his body. She looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. His eyes met hers, the gunmetal gray now dark and intense, filled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite decipher. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You're a brave woman, Evelyn Carter," he said, his voice a low rumble that resonated through her. She shivered, not from cold, but from the intensity of his gaze, the unexpected tenderness in his voice. "I'm just trying to survive," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his hand lingering on her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time and hardship. "We all are," he said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face, his eyes searching hers. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, the storm outside fading into the background, the only reality the two of them, trapped in the intimacy of the moment. Evelyn knew she should pull away, should put some distance between them, but she couldn't. She was drawn to him, mesmerized by his gaze, by the raw, untamed energy that emanated from him. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, her senses reeling. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the unexpected surge of desire that coursed through her. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened, becoming more demanding, more passionate. Evelyn responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. She had forgotten what it felt like to be held, to be desired, to feel this intense, overwhelming connection to another human being. The kiss lasted for an eternity, or perhaps only a few seconds. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding, their bodies trembling. They stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken emotions, with the realization of what had just happened, of the line they had crossed. Jesse was the first to speak, his voice hoarse, strained. "That shouldn't have happened." Evelyn nodded, her mind reeling, her body still tingling from his touch. "No," she agreed, her voice barely audible. "It shouldn't have." But even as she said the words, she knew they were a lie. It had happened, and it had changed everything. The bargain they had struck in the twilight had taken on a new dimension, a new layer of complexity and danger. The storm outside began to subside, the wind dying down, the rain softening to a drizzle. The light filtering through the cracks in the barn walls shifted, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around them. Jesse stepped back, putting some distance between them, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "I'll go check on the horses," he said, his voice rough, uneven. He turned and walked away, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the barn, her heart aching, her mind racing, her body still humming with the aftershocks of their kiss. The scent of hay and rain mingled with the lingering scent of him, a potent reminder of the forbidden desire that had flared between them, a desire that threatened to consume them both. The silence left in the barn felt emptier than before. Chapter 5. The Gunfighter's Cold Gaze. The aftermath of the kiss hung heavy in the air, an unspoken tension that permeated every interaction between Evelyn and Jesse. They avoided each other as much as possible, their conversations brief and formal, their eyes carefully averted. But the memory of that moment in the barn, the feel of his lips on hers, the surge of unexpected desire, remained, a constant, throbbing undercurrent to their carefully constructed facade of normalcy. Evelyn found herself increasingly distracted, her thoughts consumed by Jesse, by the conflicting emotions he evoked in her. She was drawn to him, fascinated by him, but also afraid of him, aware of the danger he represented, the darkness that lurked beneath his surface. She tried to focus on the ranch, on the day-to-day tasks that had always grounded her, but it was becoming increasingly difficult. Her mind would wander, replaying the kiss, imagining what it would be like to succumb to the desire that simmered between them. She knew it was madness, a dangerous game she was playing. He was a gunslinger, a man with a violent past, a man who lived outside the law. She was a rancher, a widow, a woman who had built a life of quiet respectability. They were worlds apart, their paths destined to diverge. And yet, she couldn't deny the connection she felt to him, the way he made her feel alive again, after years of quiet resignation. She had buried her emotions deep, burying them with her husband, convincing herself that she was content with her life, with the solitude of the ranch. But Jesse had awakened something within her, a dormant longing for connection, for passion, for something more. One evening, Evelyn found Jesse sitting alone by the campfire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He looked lost in thought, his expression troubled, his usual air of guardedness replaced by a vulnerability that tugged at her heart. She hesitated, unsure whether to approach him, but something compelled her to move forward. She sat down beside him, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the crackling of the fire, the chirping of crickets, the vast, whispering silence of the night. "What are you thinking about?" Evelyn finally asked, her voice soft, hesitant. He turned to her, his eyes, usually so cold and distant, now filled with a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. "The past," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It has a way of catching up with you." Evelyn nodded, understanding his words all too well. Her own past, though different from his, was a constant presence in her life, a shadow that shaped her choices, her fears, her desires. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "The life you've lived?" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. "Regret is a luxury I can't afford," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "I've made choices and I've lived with the consequences. But if you could go back," she persisted, "would you change anything?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting back to the fire, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "Maybe," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "Maybe not. It's hard to say." He looked back, with an unsettling fire that made her shift. His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the weight of a life lived on the edge, a life filled with violence and regret. Evelyn felt a surge of empathy for him, a desire to understand the man behind the legend, the pain that haunted him. "We all have regrets, Jesse," she said, her voice gentle, understanding. "Things we wish we could change, choices we wish we could take back." He looked at her, his eyes, for the first time, seeming to lose their coldness, replaced by a flicker of something akin to warmth, to connection. "You too, Evelyn Carter?" he asked, his voice a low, husky murmur. Evelyn nodded, her gaze meeting his. "Yes," she admitted, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "Even me." The gunfighter's cold gaze was still there, but something had changed. A wall was crumbling slightly. She could sense the emotional shift, but it was too fragile. She wouldn't push any further, not now. Chapter 6. Echoes of a Past Unforgiven. The fragile truce, the unspoken understanding that had tentatively formed between Evelyn and Jesse, was shattered one crisp morning by the arrival of a stranger. He rode into the yard on a lather horse, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Evelyn, who had been working in the garden, straightened up, her hand instinctively reaching for the shotgun she kept nearby. Jesse, who had been mending a fence, stopped his work, his body tensing, his eyes narrowing. The stranger dismounted, his movements stiff and awkward, his clothes dusty and torn. He looked around the yard, his gaze lingering on Jesse, a flicker of recognition or perhaps suspicion crossing his face. "I'm looking for Jesse Boone," the stranger said, his voice raspy, strained. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Jesse, whose face had become a mask of stone, his eyes cold and unreadable. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a predator about to strike. "There's no one here by that name," Evelyn said, her voice firm, resolute, despite the tremor in her hands. She had promised Jesse secrecy, and she would keep her word, even if it meant lying to this stranger, even if it meant facing unknown danger. The stranger looked at her, his eyes skeptical, disbelieving. I was told he was here," he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. "I need to speak to him. It's important." "You're mistaken," Evelyn repeated, her voice unwavering. "There's only us here. Ranch hands. And me." The stranger's gaze shifted back to Jesse, his eyes lingering on his face, studying him intently. "He looks familiar," he muttered, more to himself than to Evelyn. Jesse finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous growl that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. "You're trespassing, mister. State your business, or get off this land." The stranger flinched, his eyes widening in fear. He took a step back, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "I don't mean any trouble," he stammered. I need to deliver a message. To Jesse Boone." "I told you. There's no one here by that name," Jesse repeated, his voice colder, harder than Evelyn had ever heard it. "Now get out of here, before I lose my patience." The stranger hesitated, his eyes darting between Evelyn and Jesse, his fear battling with his determination. He looked desperate, cornered, like a man with nothing left to lose. "It's about his brother," the stranger finally blurted out, his voice cracking with emotion. "Samuel. He's in trouble." Jesse's face didn't change. His expression remained unreadable, But Evelyn saw a flicker of something: pain, grief, regret, cross his eyes. It was gone so quickly, she almost thought she had imagined it. "I don't know any Samuel," Jesse said, his voice flat, emotionless. "You've got the wrong man." The stranger shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. No, I don't," he insisted. "I know it's you. Samuel, he told me. He told me to find you. He said you were the only one who could help him." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch, identical to the one Jesse had given Evelyn. He held it out, his hand trembling. "He sent this as proof. He said you'd recognize it." Jesse stared at the pouch, his eyes fixed on it, his body rigid with tension. Evelyn could see the muscles in his jaw working, the effort he was making to control his emotions, to maintain his facade of indifference. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the stranger's ragged breathing, the distant caw of a crow, the whisper of the wind. Finally, Jesse spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "What kind of trouble?" The stranger's face crumpled, his tears flowing freely. "He's been arrested," he said, his voice choked with sobs. "Accused of murder. They're going to hang him. Unless you can help him." Jesse closed his eyes, his face a mask of pain. He stood there for a long moment, his body swaying slightly, as if he were about to collapse. Then he opened his eyes, his gaze hardening, his resolve returning. "Where?" he asked, his voice cold, sharp, like the edge of a blade. "Tombstone," the stranger replied, his voice filled with a desperate hope. "He's in the jail there, waiting for the trial." Jesse nodded, his decision made. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes meeting hers, his expression unreadable. "I have to go," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Evelyn stared at him, her heart aching, her mind racing. She knew this was coming, knew that his past would eventually catch up with him, that he would have to leave. But she hadn't expected it to happen so soon, so suddenly. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the words catching in her throat. The echoes of the past were loud, unforgiving, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that this might be the last time she ever saw him. The air was thick with the finality of it all. Chapter 7. The Dance of Dust and Danger. Jesse's departure was swift and silent. He packed his few belongings, saddled his horse, and rode off into the dawn, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the yard, watching him disappear into the vast expanse of the plains, his silhouette shrinking against the rising sun. She felt a profound sense of loss, a hollowness in her chest that echoed the emptiness of the land around her. She had known, from the moment he arrived, that he wouldn't stay, that he was a temporary presence in her life, a storm that would pass through, leaving destruction and change in its wake. But she hadn't realized how deeply he had affected her, how much she had come to rely on his presence, on his strength, on the strange, unspoken connection that had formed between them. She had allowed herself to hope, to dream, to imagine a future that was never meant to be. She returned to her work, trying to lose herself in the familiar routine of the ranch, but it was no use. Her mind was filled with images of Jesse, with memories of their conversations, of their shared moments, of the kiss that had changed everything. The ranch hands, Jed and Silas, noticed her distraction, her quiet sadness, but they didn't ask any questions. They were men of few words, their understanding expressed through actions, through their continued loyalty and hard work. Days turned into weeks, and the silence stretched, broken only by the occasional letter from Sarah, her daughter, who was increasingly concerned about her mother's well-being, urging her to sell the ranch and move to the city. Evelyn considered Sarah's pleas, knowing that it was the sensible, practical thing to do. But she couldn't bring herself to leave, to abandon the land that was so deeply ingrained in her soul, the land that held so many memories, so much history. And then one evening, as she was sitting on the porch, watching the sunset, she saw a rider approaching in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat. She knew, even before she could make out the rider's features, that it was him. Jesse rode into the yard, his horse covered in dust, his face weary and lined, but his eyes were different. They were still intense, still searching, but there was a new softness to them, a hint of vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. He dismounted, his movements stiff and slow, as if he were carrying a heavy burden. He approached her, his gaze meeting hers, his expression unreadable. "You came back," Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. He nodded, his voice a low rumble. "I told you I would." "Your brother?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He hesitated, his gaze shifting towards the horizon, as if he were looking at something far beyond the boundaries of her ranch. "He's safe," he finally said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. Evelyn didn't press him for details, understanding that he wasn't ready to share, that the story was his to tell, when and if he chose to. They stood in silence for a long moment, the air thick with unspoken emotions, with the weight of everything that had happened, of everything that was yet to come. "Why did you come back, Jessie?" Evelyn finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You could have gone anywhere. You could have disappeared." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression softening. I couldn't stay away," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. He reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek, his touch sending a shiver down her spine. "I made a promise," he said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "To protect you. To protect this ranch." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with a mixture of emotions, relief, gratitude, and something else, something deeper, something she was afraid to name. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face, his eyes locking with hers. "And there's something else," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something I need to tell you." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers, as if he were looking for the right words, for the courage to speak his truth. The dance of dust and danger had brought them back together, but the true test, the true reckoning, was yet to come. The air thrummed with anticipation, with the promise of something more, something fragile and precious, something that could either heal them or destroy them both. The wind held a low tune, and she knew. Chapter 8. Beneath a sky of broken promises. Jessie's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, with the promise of a revelation that could change everything. Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with possibilities, with fears, with a desperate hope that she hardly dared to acknowledge. The sky above them was a vast, star-studded canvas, the Milky Way a shimmering river of light stretching across the darkness. The night was still and silent, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind, the distant howl of a coyote. Jessie began, his voice faltering, his eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of vulnerability and determination. "I came back because of you, Evelyn." The words, simple and direct, struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. She had suspected, had hoped, but to hear him say it, to see the truth in his eyes, was overwhelming. "Me?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy and disbelief. He nodded, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek, his touch sending a familiar shiver down her spine. "I tried to stay away," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I told myself it was for the best, that I was no good for you, that I would only bring you trouble." But he continued, his voice gaining strength, his eyes locking with hers. "But I couldn't stop thinking about you, about this place, about the connection we have." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her emotions a tangled mess of love, fear, and a desperate longing that she had suppressed for so long. She had tried to deny it, to convince herself that it was foolish, impossible, but she couldn't lie to herself any longer. She was in love with Jesse Boone, the notorious gunslinger, the man with a violent past, the man who had walked into her life and turned it upside down. "Jesse," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He leaned closer, his breath warm on her face, his eyes filled with a tenderness that she had never seen before. "I know it's crazy," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. I know I'm not the man you deserve, but I can't help how I feel. He lowered his head, his lips brushing against hers, a tentative, questioning touch. Evelyn closed her eyes, surrendering to the moment, to the overwhelming surge of desire that coursed through her. His kiss was gentle at first, then deepened, becoming more demanding, more passionate. Evelyn responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. The years of loneliness, of quiet resignation, melted away, replaced by a fiery passion that consumed her. The kiss lasted for an eternity, or perhaps only a few seconds. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their hearts pounding, their bodies trembling. They stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken emotions, with the realization of what had just happened, of the commitment they had made, of the perilous path they had chosen to walk together. I love you, Evelyn Carter, Jesse said, his voice raw with emotion, his eyes shining with a sincerity that she couldn't doubt. The words, so unexpected, so profound, filled Evelyn with a joy so intense, it brought tears to her eyes. I love you too, Jesse Boone, she replied, her voice trembling, her heart overflowing with a love that she had never thought possible. They stood there, beneath the vast, star-studded sky, holding each other, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The broken promises of the past seemed to fade away, replaced by the promise of a new beginning, a future filled with uncertainty and danger, but also with love, with hope, with the possibility of redemption. The silence felt sacred, not empty, but charged. The wind sang a mournful tune, and the broken promises of the past lingered. Chapter 9. The Heart's Uncharted Territory. The declaration of love, spoken under the vast, starlit sky, marked a turning point in Evelyn and Jesse's relationship. It was a fragile, tentative beginning, a journey into uncharted territory, fraught with danger and uncertainty, but also filled with a profound, undeniable connection that defied logic and reason. They spent their days working side by side on the ranch, their hands brushing, their eyes meeting, their shared glances filled with a silent understanding, a secret language that only they could comprehend. They talked, sharing stories of their pasts, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Evelyn learned more about Jesse's life, about the hardships he had endured, the violence he had witnessed, the choices he had made that had led him down a path of darkness and regret. She saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt that haunted him, the longing for redemption that he carried like a heavy burden. Jesse, in turn, learned about Evelyn's life, about the quiet strength she possessed, the resilience she had shown in the face of adversity, the love she had for her daughter, for her ranch, for the land that was so deeply ingrained in her soul. He saw the warmth in her smile, the kindness in her eyes, the unwavering spirit that had endured so much loss and hardship. Their nights were spent in each other's arms, their bodies finding solace and comfort in the closeness, their lovemaking a passionate expression of the deep bond that had formed between them. They discovered a tenderness, a vulnerability that neither of them had ever experienced before, a connection that transcended the physical, reaching into the depths of their souls. But their newfound happiness was fragile, constantly threatened by the shadows of Jesse's past, by the danger that followed him like a relentless pursuer. They knew that their time together might be limited, that the outside world could intrude at any moment, shattering their fragile peace. One day, a letter arrived from Tombstone, addressed to Jesse. It was from his brother, Samuel, informing him that the charges against him had been dropped, that he was a free man. Samuel thanked Jesse for his help, for saving his life, and expressed his desire to start anew, to leave behind the violence and lawlessness that had defined their past. Jesse read the letter with a mixture of relief and sadness. He was happy for his brother, grateful that he had been given a second chance, but he also knew that their paths would likely never cross again. He had made a choice, a commitment to Evelyn, to a new life, a life that had no room for his former self. He shared the letter with Evelyn, his eyes filled with a quiet resignation. She read it, her heart aching for him, for the sacrifices he had made, for the pain he had endured. "What will you do?" she asked, her voice soft, gentle. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression filled with a love that took her breath away. "I'm already doing it," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "I'm staying here. With you." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with gratitude and a love so profound, it made her tremble. She reached out, her hand cupping his cheek, her touch conveying all the emotions that words could not express. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. They had found each other, against all odds, in the midst of a harsh and unforgiving land. They had found love, a love that was as wild and untamed as the frontier itself, a love that would be tested, challenged, but ultimately, they hoped, would endure. The heart's uncharted territory was vast, uncertain. The wind blew, carrying their hopes towards unknown horizons. Chapter 10. Where Trust and Treachery Collide. The peaceful interlude, the quiet happiness that Evelyn and Jessie had found in each other's arms, was shattered by the arrival of a posse of riders, their faces grim, their horses lathered, their presence a dark omen on the horizon. Evelyn and Jessie were working in the corral, their hands brushing as they tended to a young foal, their shared smiles reflecting the contentment they had found in their newfound love. The sudden appearance of the riders brought a halt to their work, their bodies tensing, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. The leader of the posse, a tall, imposing man with a stern face and a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest, reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, his eyes lingering on Jessie, a flicker of recognition, and something else, something colder, harder crossing his face. "We're looking for Jesse Boone," the sheriff said, his voice harsh, authoritative. "We have a warrant for his arrest." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at Jessie, whose face had become a mask of stone, his eyes cold and unreadable. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, but she could feel the tension radiating from him, the coiled energy of a predator about to strike. "There's no one here by that name," Evelyn said, her voice firm, resolute, despite the tremor in her hands. She had lied before, and she would lie again, to protect the man she loved, to shield him from the danger that threatened to engulf him. The sheriff looked at her, his eyes skeptical, disbelieving. "We have information," he said, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. "Reliable information. That he's been hiding out here. On this ranch." "You're mistaken," Evelyn repeated, her voice unwavering, her gaze meeting his directly. "There's only us here. Ranch hands. And me." The sheriff's gaze shifted back to Jessie, his eyes lingering on his face, studying him intently. "He fits the description," he muttered, more to himself than to Evelyn. The eyes that build the scar on his left cheek. Jessie finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous growl that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine. "I told you, Sheriff, you've got the wrong man. My name is Jesse Thompson. I'm a hired hand here. Nothing more." The sheriff dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his hand never leaving the gun at his hip. He approached Jessie, his eyes narrowed, his expression filled with suspicion and a growing sense of certainty. "We'll see about that," the sheriff said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We'll just take a little ride back to town. See if anyone there recognizes you." He signaled to his men, who surrounded Jessie, their guns drawn, their faces grim and determined. Evelyn stepped forward, her body instinctively moving to shield Jessie, her voice rising in protest. "You can't do this," she exclaimed. "He's done nothing wrong. You have no right." The sheriff ignored her, his gaze fixed on Jessie. "You can come quietly," he said, his voice hard and uncompromising. "Or you can make this difficult. It's your choice." Jessie looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of emotions, love, regret, and a steely resolve that she had come to recognize. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his touch conveying a silent message of reassurance, of farewell. "It's all right, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, calm murmur. "I'll go with them. I'll sort this out." He turned to the sheriff, his expression hardening, his eyes meeting his directly. "Let's go," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The posse, with Jesse in their custody, rode off, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the yard, her heart breaking, her mind racing, her body trembling with fear and a desperate, overwhelming sense of helplessness. She watched them disappear into the distance, the dust settling behind them, the silence returning, heavy and suffocating. The betrayal was clear. Someone must have talked. She didn't know who had betrayed Jesse, who had revealed his identity to the authorities, but she knew that she had to do something, anything, to help him. She couldn't just stand by and watch him be taken away, to face an uncertain fate, a past that he had tried so hard to escape. Trust and treachery had collided, and Evelyn found herself caught in the crossfire, her love for Jesse, her loyalty to him, tested to its limits. The wind howled. Chapter 11. The weight of unspoken words. The days following Jesse's arrest stretched into an agonizing eternity. Evelyn moved through her chores like a ghost, her mind consumed by worry, her heart heavy with a grief that threatened to suffocate her. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, her every waking moment filled with images of Jesse, of his face, his touch, his voice, the memory of his love a constant ache in her soul. She had sent a telegram to Sarah, her daughter, informing her of the situation, asking for her help, for any information she might have about Jesse's past, about the charges against him. Sarah's reply was swift and concerned, but offered little solace. She knew nothing about Jesse's life before he arrived at the ranch, and she urged her mother to be cautious, to distance herself from a man who was clearly dangerous. Evelyn ignored Sarah's warnings, her loyalty to Jesse unwavering. She knew he was a good man, despite his past, despite the accusations against him. She had seen the kindness in his eyes, the gentleness in his touch, the love he had shown her. She couldn't believe that he was capable of the crimes he was accused of. She visited the local sheriff, a man named Thompson, no relation to the alias Jesse had used, seeking information about Jesse's case, about his well-being. The sheriff was uncooperative, evasive, his answers vague and unsettling. He told her that Jesse was being held in the county jail, awaiting trial, that the charges against him were serious, that the evidence was overwhelming. "He's a dangerous man, Mrs. Carter," the sheriff said, his voice stern warning. "A killer. You'd be wise to forget about him. Move on with your life." Evelyn refused to listen, her determination fueled by her love for Jesse, by her unwavering belief in his innocence. She hired a lawyer, a young, ambitious man named Henry Davis, who had a reputation for taking on difficult cases, for fighting for the underdog. Davis was initially reluctant to take on Jesse's case, admitting that the evidence against him was strong, that the odds of winning were slim. But Evelyn's persistence, her unwavering faith in Jesse, her willingness to pay any price, convinced him to take the case. Davis visited Jesse in jail, gathering information, preparing his defense. He reported back to Evelyn, his assessment grim, his tone cautious. "He's not talking, Mrs. Carter," Davis said, his voice filled with frustration. "He refuses to cooperate. He won't tell me anything about his past, about the events that led to his arrest. He just keeps saying he's innocent, that he'll handle it himself." Evelyn's heart sank. She knew Jesse's stubborn pride, his reluctance to ask for help, his tendency to shoulder his burdens alone. But she also knew that he needed her, that he couldn't face this alone. She decided to visit him in jail, to confront him, to make him understand that he had to fight, that he had to trust her, that he had to let her help him. The visit was painful, heartbreaking. She saw him through the bars of his cell, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a weariness that tore at her soul. He looked defeated, resigned, as if he had already given up hope. They talked, their conversation strained, their words heavy with unspoken emotions, with the weight of everything that had happened, of everything that was at stake. "Jesse," Evelyn pleaded, her voice trembling, her eyes filled with tears. "You have to fight. You have to tell the lawyer everything. You can't do this alone." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of love, regret, and a stubborn refusal to surrender. "I can handle it, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I don't want you involved. I don't want you dragged into this mess." "I'm already involved, Jessie," she cried, her voice rising in desperation. "I love you. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm going to fight for you, whether you like it or not." He reached out, his hand reaching through the bars, his fingers gently touching her cheek. "You're a stubborn woman, Evelyn Carter," he said, his voice filled with a grudging admiration. "And you're a stubborn man, Jesse Boone," she replied, her voice softening, her tears flowing freely. "But we're in this together. We'll face this together." He closed his eyes, his face a mask of pain. He finally nodded, his silent acquiescence a small victory, a fragile glimmer of hope in the darkness that surrounded them. The unspoken words hung heavier, however. Chapter 12. A flame in the gathering darkness. The breakthrough, however small, fueled Evelyn's determination. She threw herself into the fight for Jesse's freedom, working tirelessly with Henry Davis, the lawyer, gathering information, interviewing witnesses, searching for any evidence that could exonerate him. She discovered that the charges against Jesse stemmed from an incident that had occurred years ago in a small town in Arizona. He was accused of killing a man during a saloon brawl, a man who, it turned out, was the son of a powerful and influential rancher, a man named Silas Blackwood, the same Blackwood who had been trying to steal Evelyn's ranch. The realization hit Evelyn like a physical blow. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, revealing a picture that was far more complex, far more sinister than she had initially imagined. Jesse's past, his connection to the Blackwoods, his reason for coming to her ranch, it was all intertwined, a tangled web of revenge, betrayal, and a long-standing feud that had finally caught up with him. Evelyn confronted Jesse with her discovery, demanding answers, demanding the truth. He was reluctant at first, hesitant to reveal the details of his past, to expose the darkness that he had tried so hard to bury. But Evelyn's persistence, her unwavering love, her refusal to give up on him, finally broke through his defenses. He told her the story, his voice raw with emotion, his eyes filled with a pain that she could only begin to imagine. He had, indeed, killed a man in a saloon brawl, but it had been in self-defense. The man, young and reckless, had been drunk and violent, threatening Jesse and his brother, Samuel. Jesse had tried to defuse the situation, to avoid a fight, but the man had attacked him, forcing Jesse to defend himself. The man's father, Silas Blackwood, had used his influence and power to frame Jesse for murder, to manipulate the witnesses, to ensure that he would be convicted. Jesse had fled, becoming a fugitive, living on the run, constantly looking over his shoulder, haunted by the past. His brother, Samuel, had tried to help him, to clear his name, but he had been caught in the crossfire, arrested and falsely accused of murder himself. Jesse had come to Evelyn's ranch, seeking refuge, a place to hide, a place to plan his next move, to find a way to save his brother. Evelyn listened, her heart aching for him, for the injustice he had suffered, for the burden he had carried for so long. She understood now, his reluctance to trust, his fear of attachment, his determination to protect her from his past. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked, her voice soft, gentle. He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I didn't want to involve you," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "I didn't want to put you in danger. I didn't want you to know the kind of man I was." "You're not that man anymore, Jesse," she said, her voice firm, resolute. "You've changed. You're a good man. And I'm going to prove it." Armed with the truth, Evelyn and Henry Davis worked tirelessly to build a defense, to expose the Blackwoods' lies, to uncover the evidence that would prove Jesse's innocence. It was a difficult, dangerous task, facing opposition from powerful forces, risking their own safety, their own reputations. But Evelyn was undeterred, her love for Jesse fueling her determination, her belief in his innocence giving her strength. She was a flame in the gathering darkness, a beacon of hope in a world of shadows and lies. She wouldn't rest until Jesse was free, until justice was served. The air was filled with a new hope, a tiny spark in a sea of despair. Chapter 13. The Scars That Bind and Break. The trial was a tense, emotionally charged affair, held in the small, dusty courtroom of Tombstone. The room was packed with spectators, their eyes filled with curiosity, with suspicion, with a morbid fascination for the notorious gunslinger who stood accused of murder. Evelyn sat in the front row, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands clasped tightly together, her gaze fixed on Jesse, who sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and a steely resolve that she had come to recognize. Henry Davis, the young lawyer, presented a passionate and compelling defense, arguing that Jesse had acted in self-defense, that the witnesses against him had been coerced and manipulated by Silas Blackwood, that the evidence had been fabricated to frame an innocent man. He called witnesses who testified to Jesse's good character, to his reputation for honesty and fairness, to his attempts to avoid violence whenever possible. He presented evidence that contradicted the prosecution's claims, revealing inconsistencies and lies in their case. But the prosecution, led by a seasoned and ruthless lawyer named Marcus Thorne, presented a formidable challenge. Thorne painted a picture of Jesse as a cold-blooded killer, a dangerous outlaw who had murdered an innocent young man in cold blood. He called witnesses who testified to Jesse's violent past, to his reputation as a gunslinger, to his willingness to use deadly force. The trial dragged on for days, the tension in the courtroom growing with each passing hour. Evelyn watched, her heart aching for Jesse, her anxiety mounting with every setback, every challenge, every twist and turn in the legal battle. She saw the toll the trial was taking on Jesse, the strain etched on his face, the weariness in his eyes, the hope slowly fading from his gaze. He remained silent throughout the proceedings, refusing to testify on his own behalf, his stubborn pride, his fear of exposing his past, preventing him from speaking out, from defending himself. Evelyn knew that Jesse's silence was damaging his case, that the jury needed to hear his side of the story, to see the man she knew, the man she loved. She pleaded with him, during their brief, guarded visits in the jail, to testify, to fight for his freedom, to trust in her, in their lawyer, in the truth. Finally, on the last day of the trial, as the prosecution rested its case, Jesse relented. He agreed to testify, to tell his story, to expose the lies and deceit that had led to his arrest. He took the stand, his voice calm and steady, his eyes meeting the jury's gaze directly. He told his story, his voice raw with emotion, his words filled with the pain and regret of a life lived on the edge, a life haunted by violence and injustice. He described the events of that fateful night in the saloon, his attempts to avoid a confrontation, the young man's drunken aggression, the desperate struggle for survival, the shot that had ended a life, the guilt that had haunted him ever since. He spoke of his flight, his life on the run, his constant fear of capture, his determination to protect his brother, to clear his name, to find a measure of peace. He spoke of Evelyn, of his love for her, of the new life he had found with her, of the hope that she had given him, of the redemption he had sought in her arms. His testimony was powerful, moving, his words ringing with sincerity, with truth, with the raw, unvarnished emotion of a man who had nothing left to lose. The courtroom was silent, the spectators captivated by his story, by his honesty, by the vulnerability he had finally allowed himself to reveal. The scars that bound and broke him were laid bare for all to see, the wounds of the past exposed, the pain and regret etched on his face, in his voice, in his very soul. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken emotions, with a sense of shared humanity. Chapter 14. Rivers of Regret and Redemption. After Jesse's powerful testimony, the prosecution attempted a rebuttal, but their efforts felt weak and hollow in comparison to the raw honesty of Jesse's words. Marcus Thorne, the prosecuting attorney, tried to paint Jesse's self-defense claim as a fabrication, a desperate attempt to escape justice, but his arguments lacked conviction, his usual confidence replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. The jury deliberated for hours, their faces grim, their expressions unreadable. Evelyn waited, her heart pounding in her chest, her anxiety almost unbearable. She sat in the courtroom, surrounded by a handful of supporters, Jed and Silas, her loyal ranch hands, and Sarah, her daughter, who had finally come to understand, to accept her mother's love for Jesse. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the courtroom grew, the silence stretching, heavy and suffocating. Evelyn closed her eyes, praying for a miracle, for justice, for Jesse's freedom. Finally, the jury returned, their faces somber, their verdict unknown. The foreman, a weathered old rancher with kind eyes, stood up, his voice trembling slightly. "In the matter of the state versus Jesse Boone," he announced, his voice echoing through the silent courtroom, "we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by a stunned silence. Evelyn's eyes flew open, her heart leaping with joy, with relief, with a gratitude so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. Jesse, who had been sitting stoically, his face pale and drawn, closed his eyes, his body sagging with relief, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek. He had been given a second chance, a chance to live, to love, to finally escape the shadows of his past. Evelyn rushed to him, embracing him, her tears flowing freely, her body trembling with emotion. He held her tight, his arms wrapping around her, his face buried in her hair, his whispered words of love and gratitude lost in the joyous chaos that erupted around them. The courtroom erupted in cheers, in applause, in a collective outpouring of relief and celebration. Jed and Silas slapped Jesse on the back, their faces beaming with pride and happiness. Sarah, her eyes filled with tears, hugged her mother, finally understanding the depth of her love for this extraordinary man. Marcus Thorne, defeated and humiliated, gathered his papers and left the courtroom, his head hung low, his reputation tarnished, his career possibly ruined. Silas Blackwood, who had been sitting in the back of the courtroom, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, stormed out, his dreams of revenge shattered, his power diminished. Jesse and Evelyn walked out of the courtroom, hand in hand, into the bright sunlight of a new day, a new beginning. They had faced the darkness, they had overcome adversity, they had found love and redemption in the most unlikely of places. The rivers of regret and redemption had flowed together, cleansing the past, washing away the pain and guilt, leaving behind a future filled with hope, with promise, with the possibility of a life lived in peace, in love, in the embrace of a land that had finally welcomed them home. The air was clear, and it was a triumphant moment. Chapter 15. The Howl of a Distant Storm. The immediate aftermath of the trial was a blur of celebration and quiet reflection. Jesse and Evelyn returned to the ranch, welcomed as heroes by Jed and Silas, who had prepared a feast of roasted meat, beans, and cornbread, a simple but heartfelt celebration of their victory. They spent the evening surrounded by friends, by the warmth of the fire, by the shared joy of a hard-won battle. They laughed, they talked, they shared stories, their hearts overflowing with gratitude and a sense of profound relief. But as the night wore on and the celebration subsided, a quiet unease settled over Evelyn. She knew that Silas Blackwood wouldn't take his defeat lightly, that he was a man consumed by hatred and revenge, that he wouldn't rest until he had exacted his pound of flesh. She voiced her concerns to Jesse, her voice filled with apprehension. "He won't let this go, Jesse," she said, her eyes searching his. "He'll come after us. He'll try to hurt us." Jesse nodded, his face grim, his eyes filled with a steely resolve. "I know," he said, his voice a low, calm murmur. "But I won't let him. I'll protect you, Evelyn. I'll protect this ranch. I'll protect our life together." His words were reassuring, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom, the sense that a storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm that threatened to destroy everything they had fought so hard to achieve. Her fears were confirmed a few days later, when a group of riders appeared on the edge of their property, their faces hidden by bandanas, their intentions clearly hostile. They were Blackwood's men, come to exact revenge, to carry out their master's orders. Jesse, who had been expecting this, was prepared. He had armed himself and Jed and Silas, turning the ranch into a fortress, ready to defend their home, their lives, their love. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Gunfire erupted, echoing across the plains, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of men and horses, the chilling sound of death. Evelyn, armed with a rifle, fought alongside Jesse, her courage fueled by her love for him, by her determination to protect their home, their future. She was a rancher, a woman of the land, and she wouldn't be intimidated. She wouldn't surrender. She wouldn't let anyone take away what was rightfully hers. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain, the balance of power shifting back and forth. Jesse, a skilled and experienced gunfighter, fought with a ferocity that surprised even Evelyn, his movements precise and deadly, his aim unerring. But the Blackwood gang was larger, more numerous, and they were relentless in their attack. Jed and Silas were wounded, their bodies riddled with bullets, their lives hanging in the balance. Evelyn, too, was injured, a bullet grazing her arm, the pain searing but manageable. She fought on, her determination unwavering, her love for Jesse giving her strength. As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the blood-soaked ground, the tide of the battle began to turn. Jesse, with a combination of skill, courage, and sheer luck, managed to kill several of Blackwood's men, including their leader, a ruthless outlaw named Red Harlan. The remaining members of the gang, demoralized and outnumbered, retreated, fleeing into the gathering darkness, leaving behind their dead and wounded comrades. The battle was over, but the victory was bittersweet. Jed and Silas were alive, but their injuries were serious, their recovery uncertain. Evelyn's wound was superficial, but the emotional scars ran deep. The ranch was damaged, the buildings riddled with bullet holes, the land scarred by violence. The howl of a distant storm had been heard, and its echoes reverberated through their lives, a stark reminder of the fragility of their peace, of the ever-present danger that lurked in the shadows. The silence left in the battle's wake was unnerving. Chapter 16. Between Fury and Forgiveness. The days following the attack were a blur of tending to the wounded, repairing the damage, and burying the dead. Evelyn worked tirelessly, her hands raw and bleeding, her body exhausted, but her spirit unbroken. She nursed Jed and Silas, her heart filled with gratitude for their loyalty, their bravery, their willingness to sacrifice their lives for her and Jesse. Jesse, too, was tireless in his efforts, his strength and resilience a source of comfort and inspiration to Evelyn. He oversaw the repairs to the ranch, his hands calloused and scarred, his face grim and determined. He rarely spoke, his emotions buried deep, his focus on the task at hand, on rebuilding their lives, on protecting their future. But Evelyn knew that beneath his stoic exterior, he was struggling. She saw the pain in his eyes, the guilt that haunted him, the burden of responsibility he carried for the violence, for the deaths, for the destruction that had been wrought upon their land. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, Evelyn reached out, her hand gently touching his. "It's not your fault, Jesse," she said, her voice soft, understanding. "You didn't ask for this. You were defending our home, our lives." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anguish and gratitude. "I should have known," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "I should have anticipated this. I should have protected you better. You did everything you could," she insisted, her voice firm, resolute. "You saved our lives. You saved Jed and Silas. You saved our ranch." He shook his head, his face a mask of self-reproach. "But at what cost?" he asked, his voice filled with a bitter irony. "More violence, more death, more destruction. It's a cycle that never ends." Evelyn understood his despair, his disillusionment, his longing for a peace that seemed forever out of reach. She had felt it herself, the weight of the world on her shoulders, the constant threat of violence, the endless struggle for survival. It doesn't have to be that way, Jessie, she said, her voice filled with a quiet hope. We can break the cycle. We can choose a different path. We can find peace, together. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression softening. Do you really believe that, Evelyn? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She nodded, her gaze meeting his directly. I do, she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised even herself. I have to. Otherwise, what's the point? He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his touch sending a familiar shiver down her spine. You're a remarkable woman, Evelyn Carter, he said, his voice filled with admiration and a love that took her breath away. And you're a remarkable man, Jesse Boone, she replied, her voice trembling slightly, her heart overflowing with emotion. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. They had found solace in each other's arms, a refuge from the storm, a sanctuary of love and hope in a world of violence and despair. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges, but they would face it together, their love a guiding light, their courage a shield, their forgiveness a balm for the wounds of the past. The space between fury and forgiveness was vast, but they chose to reside in the latter. Chapter 17. The cracks in a hardened facade. Despite the outward appearance of healing and rebuilding, a subtle tension lingered between Evelyn and Jesse. The violence of the attack had shaken them both, exposing vulnerabilities and reopening old wounds. Jesse, in particular, seemed to withdraw into himself, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by a brooding silence that Evelyn found increasingly unsettling. She tried to reach him, to break through the walls he had erected around his heart, but he remained distant, his emotions guarded, his thoughts hidden from her. She knew he was struggling with guilt, with the burden of responsibility for the lives that had been lost, for the damage that had been done. One afternoon, while they were working together in the corral, tending to the horses, Evelyn decided to confront him. She stopped her work, her hand resting on the smooth, warm flank of a mare, her gaze meeting Jesse's directly. Talk to me, Jesse, she said, her voice soft but firm. Tell me what's going on inside you. Don't shut me out. He avoided her gaze, his eyes fixed on the ground, his hands continuing their work, his movements mechanical, devoid of their usual grace and precision. There's nothing to talk about, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. That's not true, Evelyn insisted, her voice rising slightly. I see the pain in your eyes, the sadness in your face. You're carrying this burden alone, and you don't have to. He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anguish and a stubborn refusal to surrender to his emotions. It's my fault, Evelyn, he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. All of it. The deaths, the injuries, the destruction, it's all on me. No, it's not, Evelyn countered, her voice filled with conviction. You were defending our home, our lives. You were protecting us from a man who is consumed by hatred and revenge. But if I hadn't come here, he persisted, his voice laced with self-reproach, none of this would have happened. You would have been safe. Jed and Silas wouldn't have been hurt. The ranch wouldn't have been damaged. Evelyn stepped closer, her hand reaching out to touch his arm, her touch conveying a silent message of understanding, of compassion, of unwavering love. Don't do this, Jesse, she said, her voice gentle, soothing. Don't blame yourself. You can't change the past. All we can do is learn from it and move forward. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression softening slightly. I don't know if I can, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know if I can forgive myself. Then let me forgive you, Evelyn said, her voice filled with a quiet strength. Let me help you carry this burden. Let me love you, through the pain, through the guilt, through the darkness. He closed his eyes, his body trembling slightly, his resistance finally crumbling. He leaned into her touch, his head resting on her shoulder, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. I love you, Evelyn, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I don't deserve you, but I love you. And I love you, Jesse, she replied, her voice filled with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. And you do deserve me. You deserve all the happiness, all the love, all the peace in the world." They stood there, in the quiet intimacy of the corral, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The cracks in Jesse's hardened facade were beginning to show, the vulnerability beneath the surface finally emerging, the healing process beginning. The silence was a comforting blanket. Chapter 18. A glimpse of the dawn's embrace. The healing process was slow and gradual, but with Evelyn's unwavering love and support, Jesse began to emerge from the darkness that had enveloped him. He started to talk, to share his feelings, to express the guilt and regret that had been haunting him for so long. Evelyn listened patiently, her heart aching for him, her presence a constant source of comfort and reassurance. She didn't judge him, didn't condemn him. She simply loved him, unconditionally, accepting him for who he was, flaws and all. They spent hours talking, walking through the fields, sitting on the porch, watching the sunsets, their conversations ranging from the mundane to the profound, their shared silence as meaningful as their spoken words. Jesse began to open up about his past, about his childhood, about the events that had shaped him, that had led him down a path of violence and regret. He spoke of his father, a harsh and unforgiving man who had taught him to fight, to survive, to show no weakness. He spoke of his mother, a gentle and loving woman who had died too young, leaving a void in his life that he had never been able to fill. He spoke of his brother, Samuel, their bond forged in hardship, their loyalty to each other tested by adversity, their paths diverging, their lives forever intertwined. Evelyn listened, her heart filled with empathy, with understanding, with a growing appreciation for the complex, multifaceted man that Jesse was. She saw the scars he carried, both visible and invisible, the wounds of the past that had shaped him, that had made him the man he was. And she loved him, not in spite of those scars, but because of them. She saw the strength, the resilience, the vulnerability that lay beneath the surface, the goodness that he had tried so hard to suppress, the potential for redemption that she had always believed in. As Jesse healed, their relationship deepened, their love growing stronger, more resilient, more profound. They found joy in the simple things, in the beauty of the land, in the companionship of their animals, in the quiet intimacy of their shared moments. They started to make plans for the future, for a life together, a life built on love, on trust, on forgiveness. They talked of rebuilding the ranch, of raising a family, of growing old together, surrounded by the peace and tranquility of the land they loved. One morning, as they were standing on the porch, watching the sunrise, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, a glorious spectacle of light and color, Jesse turned to Evelyn, his eyes filled with a love that took her breath away. "Marry me, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, husky murmur. "Be my wife. Share my life. Let's build a future together." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, her heart overflowing with a joy so intense, it made her tremble. She reached out, her hand cupping his cheek, her touch conveying all the emotions that words could not express. "Yes, Jesse," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, I will." They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The glimpse of the dawn's embrace was a promise of a new beginning, a future filled with hope, with love, with the possibility of a life lived in peace, in harmony, in the embrace of a land that had finally welcomed them home. The light was healing. Chapter 19. The Reckoning of Past Sins. The wedding was a small, intimate affair, held on the porch of the ranch house, under the vast, open sky. Jed and Silas, fully recovered from their injuries, stood as witnesses, their faces beaming with pride and happiness. Sarah, Evelyn's daughter, attended, her initial reservations about Jesse completely erased by his bravery, his devotion to her mother, and the undeniable love that radiated between them. Evelyn wore a simple white dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers, her face radiant with joy. Jesse wore a clean shirt and trousers, his usual gun belt replaced by a simple leather belt, his eyes filled with a love that made Evelyn's heart soar. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, their vows spoken with sincerity and a deep understanding of the commitment they were making, the challenges they had overcome, the future they were embracing. As they exchanged rings, a symbol of their eternal love, a hawk circled overhead, its sharp cry echoing across the plains, a blessing from the land, a sign of hope, of renewal, of a new beginning. After the ceremony, they celebrated with a simple feast, sharing food, laughter, and stories with their small circle of friends and family. The atmosphere was filled with joy, with gratitude, with a sense of profound peace. But even in the midst of their happiness, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that their past was not entirely behind them, that Silas Blackwood still posed a threat, that the reckoning of his sins was yet to come. Her fears were confirmed a few weeks later when a letter arrived, addressed to Jesse. It was from a lawyer in Tombstone, informing him that Silas Blackwood had been found dead, his body discovered in a remote canyon, the cause of death uncertain. The letter hinted at foul play, suggesting that Blackwood's death might not have been accidental, that he might have been murdered. The lawyer requested Jesse's presence in Tombstone to answer questions, to provide information that might help with the investigation. Jesse read the letter, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of apprehension and a sense of grim satisfaction. He knew that Blackwood's death, while seemingly a resolution to their long-standing feud, could also bring new complications, new dangers. He shared the letter with Evelyn, his voice filled with concern. "I have to go, Evelyn," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I have to find out what happened. I have to make sure this doesn't come back to haunt us." Evelyn nodded, her heart heavy with a premonition of trouble, but her trust in Jesse unwavering. "I understand," she said, her voice soft but firm.
Go.
"Find out the truth. And come back to me." Jesse left for Tombstone, his journey a reckoning with the past, a final confrontation with the shadows that had haunted him for so long. Evelyn remained at the ranch, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope, her love for Jesse a constant source of strength. She would await his return and the conclusion. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Jesse's time in Tombstone was a tense and unsettling experience. He was questioned by the sheriff, interrogated by lawyers, and confronted by the lingering suspicions of a town that had once condemned him. He maintained his innocence, insisting that he had nothing to do with Blackwood's death, that he had been at the ranch with Evelyn at the time of the incident. But the evidence was circumstantial, and the whispers of doubt persisted. Some believed that Jesse had orchestrated Blackwood's murder, seeking revenge for the years of persecution, for the false accusations, for the attempt on his life. Others believed that Blackwood's death was the result of his own misdeeds, that he had made too many enemies, that his violent past had finally caught up with him. Jesse cooperated with the investigation, providing alibis, answering questions, offering any information that might help to uncover the truth. He was determined to clear his name, to remove any lingering suspicion, to protect his future with Evelyn. After days of intense scrutiny, the investigation took an unexpected turn. A witness came forward, a young woman who had worked as a maid in Blackwood's house. She testified that she had overheard Blackwood arguing with his son, Marcus, the lawyer who had prosecuted Jesse, just hours before Blackwood's death. The argument, she said, had been heated and violent, with Marcus accusing his father of ruining his life, of destroying his career, of driving him to the brink of despair. She had heard a gunshot, followed by silence, and then she had seen Marcus fleeing the scene, his face pale and distraught. The sheriff, armed with this new evidence, arrested Marcus Thorne, charging him with the murder of his father. Thorne, faced with the overwhelming evidence against him, confessed to the crime, his motive a mixture of revenge, resentment, and a desperate attempt to escape his father's controlling influence. Jesse was cleared of all suspicion, his name finally exonerated, his past finally put to rest. He returned to the ranch, to Evelyn, his heart filled with relief, with gratitude, with a profound sense of closure. Evelyn welcomed him home with open arms, her love for him unwavering, her joy at his return overflowing. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one, the final confrontation of their past resolved, their future stretching before them, bright and promising. They stood on the porch of their ranch house, hand in hand, watching the sunset, the sky ablaze with color, the land stretching out before them, vast and beautiful. They had faced the darkness, they had overcome adversity, they had found love and redemption in the most unlikely of places. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons had been won, their love a testament to their resilience, their courage, their unwavering commitment to each other. They had built a life together, a life rooted in the land, in their shared love, in their enduring hope for a future filled with peace, with happiness, with the promise of a new dawn. The air was filled with peace. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love and forgiveness. Jesse and Evelyn rebuilt the ranch, their home becoming a haven of peace and tranquility, a place where friends and family gathered, where laughter echoed across the plains, where the scars of the past slowly faded, replaced by the gentle balm of time and shared happiness. Jed and Silas, their loyal ranch hands, remained with them, their friendship a constant source of support and companionship. Sarah, Evelyn's daughter, became a frequent visitor, her children growing up with the love of the land, the freedom of the open spaces, the wisdom of their grandparents' enduring love story. Jesse never completely shed the shadow of his past, the memories of violence and loss lingering in the depths of his soul. But he found solace in Evelyn's love, in the quiet rhythm of ranch life, in the beauty of the land that had become his home. He learned to forgive himself, to accept the choices he had made, to find redemption in the love he shared with Evelyn, in the life they had built together. Evelyn, too, carried the scars of the past, the memories of hardship and loss, the lingering fear of a world that had once threatened to destroy everything she held dear. But she found strength in Jesse's love, in his unwavering devotion, in the peace and security of their home. She embraced the future, her heart filled with gratitude for the second chance they had been given, for the love that had blossomed in the midst of adversity. They grew old together, their bodies aging, their steps slowing, but their love remaining as strong and vibrant as the day they had first met. They watched the sunsets together, hand in hand, their shared silence filled with a lifetime of memories, of shared experiences, of a love that had defied the odds, that had conquered the darkness, that had endured the test of time. And as the final sunset faded and the stars began to emerge, painting the vast expanse of the sky with their shimmering light, Evelyn and Jesse knew that their love story, a tale of a debt in blood, a journey of redemption, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, would live on, whispered on the wind, carried across the plains, a legend etched in the heart of the land they loved. The final piece was a gift.